This is The Listening Tube.
Well, hello! Welcome to Season 12, Episode 1 of The Listening Tube. I'm your host, Bob Woodley.
He's a nut job, but he's still sharp.
Thank you for allowing me to take a couple weeks off. The only thing in my life that has changed in the last 3 weeks is that I went fishing from a kayak for the first time. Did I miss anything? I guess not. On this episode, we'll hear about Iran, independence, and currency. Plus, I'll speak with an authority on biblical prophecy. Did the Bible warn him about me? But first,
Not the headlines.
by the time you hear this, the United States Supreme Court will have concluded its term. Many of the decisions will be the results of lawsuits brought by proponents of illegal immigrants and others fighting for the status quo after the Trump administration cut funding somewhere or took something away from a social program or government agency that the president felt wasn't worth the investment. There are a variety of arguments as to why the cuts were made, but that's irrelevant here. The point is, we're going to have a much clearer picture of where the powers and responsibilities of the executive and judicial branches of our government lie.
And you can hang your hat on that.
The Democrats and others on the progressive side of the aisle have perfected the tactic of using the judicial system to slow down the will of the people who voted for Donald Trump. Many of the lawsuits filed against Trump directives have been favored by friendly judges, perhaps not in a genuine attempt to win, but at the very least slow the process so that the Trump administration cannot claim victories. That type of obstructionism is harmful to the American citizen public. It's also harmful to anyone else living in the U.S. legally. According to lawfaremedia.org, there are almost 300 court cases involving the Trump administration being tracked. Some of them have made it to the Supreme Court. In most cases, the Trump administration has been favored. One that stands out is the case of the man from El Salvador. The court ordered the executive branch to facilitate his return to the U.S. It took a few months, but he's back here now, charged with transporting illegal immigrants across state lines. Regardless of his guilt or innocence, he'll be sent out of the country, and now, because of a Supreme Court decision, he could be sent to a country he's never seen before. Thanks to lawsuits from progressives who insisted the man get due process, which he already had. I'm sure that guy is muy grateful for all the help he got from liberal judges and the progressive organizations who paved the way for him to probably wind up in Somalia. Congratulations. You won the legal battle. But there's more to come. I might have to rewrite some of this episode at the last minute because of the magnitude of some of the decisions the court may bring us. This just in, the Supreme Court rules that U.S. district judges can't impose nationwide restrictions on executive orders. Justice Barrett, who has recently been criticized for not being far enough right, wrote the majority decision. What it basically said was that even if a judge thinks the executive branch is going too far, that doesn't give the judicial branch the right to do the same thing. The difference is that the president and the Supreme Court do have authority over the entire country, and district judges do not. This decision will ultimately, if not immediately, nullify many or all of the injunctions placed on the Trump administration by activist judges. How do we know they're activist judges? As Attorney General Pam Bondi pointed out after the ruling, 35 of the 40 active injunctions against the president were imposed by 5 specific districts. The Supreme Court just slapped them back into reality for the moment. The Supreme Court decision doesn't mean these judges won't still be activists, but their influence now has a much narrower scope, relegated to the case before them and not applicable to the rest of the country. That's not just a victory for the Trump administration, but also a victory for the Constitution and all future presidents, regardless of political viewpoints. Some U.S. district judges had outgrown their authority and needed to be reined in. Even though some big decisions are coming down in the favor of the Trump administration, it seems like the president is always on defense when it comes to the law. He's been overwhelmed with lawsuits questioning the legality of his policies, unlike anything we've ever seen. Many say it's because he's trying to break the law, but no laws have been proven to be broken. The Trump administration is under strict orders to follow all judicial orders, and they have. Yet there are people who insist that the Trump administration is somehow trying to erode the independence of the judicial branch. That argument is a joke, as it's the judicial branch that ultimately decides which branch has what powers and responsibilities. The birthright citizen case clearly demonstrates that, as we've already heard. The Democrats' lawsuits against the Trump administration may have some unintended consequences. More on unintended consequences later in the program with my guest, Dr. Bob Thiel. But what the left's lawfare will surely do is make the lines of power and responsibility among the three branches of government more clearly drawn. Regardless of which side wins, we'll have to live with it for the next couple of generations at the very least, perhaps forever. But the Trump administration isn't only playing defense. Just last week, a lawsuit was filed by the Justice Department against the U.S. District Court for the Maryland District and each individual judge in the district. As you may know, the Maryland Chief Judge signed an order delaying detention for 2 business days for anyone who challenged their deportation orders. The federal government calls that a violation of its rights to control immigration, both legal and illegal. And because each individual judge in the district, 15 in all, were named in the lawsuit, they'll be expected to recuse themselves from the case. It will likely end up being decided by another district, maybe one that is friendly to the Trump administration. But like many other cases, it could end up in the Supreme Court. The suit argues that the judges are practicing an unlawful use of equitable powers to restrain the executive branch, according to the complaint. It seems like the Trump administration has finally figured out how to play offense in the game of lawfare. The Supreme Court may have to put in some overtime to get through all of the confusion over who has what powers settled. But maybe they won't mind too much if the big beautiful bill gets passed and they don't have to pay taxes on all that overtime. Unless someone on the left files a lawsuit against that too.
Let's go back through the listening tube for this week in history.
This is a big week for countries to gain their independence. For example, this week in 1960, Ghana becomes a republic and Kwame Nkrumah becomes its first president as Queen Elizabeth II of the United Kingdom ceases to be its head of state. Also in 1960, Somalia declared its independence. 2 years later, this week in 1962, Burundi declared its independence. Also this week in 1962, Rwanda declared its independence. There must be something special about this week of the calendar when it comes to independence, seeing as all those countries declared independence in the same calendar week. Oh, did I forget to mention the independence of the United States of America happened this week in 1776? I recently had a conversation with a woman who has a new Declaration of Independence. We'll hear from her next week.
The 1900s.
This week in 1968, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is signed in Washington, D.C., London, and Moscow by 62 countries. I'm guessing Iran wasn't one of them. By the way, the American attack on Iran's nuclear laboratories was perhaps the most consequential military action since the end of the Second World War. I believe it will result in a period of peace in the Middle East, and that the world is much safer when Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapon.
Sincerely, the Listening Tube.
This week in 1971, Ohio ratifies the 26th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, reducing the voting age from 21 to 18, thereby putting the amendment into effect. I was glad that I was allowed to vote at age 18, but in hindsight, I wasn't really educated enough to make a well-informed decision. As it turns out, I didn't. This week in 1990, German reunification happens. East Germany accepts the Deutschmark as its currency, thus uniting the economies of East and West Germany. There were a lot of different currencies in Europe back then. When I was in West Berlin in the mid-'80s, you kind of had to keep track of the currency exchange rates to try to save some money here and there. We had the West German Deutschmark, the East German mark, the French franc, the Dutch guilder, plus the British pound, which still exists. But the rest have been replaced by the euro, which only became possible after the reunification of East and West Germany after the fall of the Soviet Union. When I was in West Berlin, there was something called a Pfennig check. A Pfennig was the West German equivalent of an American penny, 1/100th of a mark, like a penny is 1/100th of a dollar. A Pfennig check happens in a bar. If someone called for a Pfennig check, you had to produce a Pfennig, or you were required to buy a round. Depending upon the crowd, that could add up to quite a few marks or dollars. I got into the habit of carrying a Pfennig in my wallet just for such occasions. That was back in 1985. To this day, I still carry a West German Pfennig in my wallet. They don't make them anymore, but I'm not taking any chances. And by the way, the United States will soon stop making pennies as well.
The Listening Tube will return at the speed of sound. Send email to thelisteningtube@outlook.com.
My guest this week is an authority on biblical prophecy. He's Dr. Bob Thiel, and he spent some time with me in the Listening Tube. In addition to religion, he's also well educated in science and philosophy. Now, you've studied religion, philosophy, science. You seem to be a very well-rounded individual. You might be the perfect person for me to ask, what is the difference between a philosophy and a religion?
Okay, there's one I've never been asked before. A philosophy is just basically how people view certain things. Religion, if you're talking about true religion, is more than that. True religion is a deeply ingrained belief system, whereas a philosophy, they tend to vary a bit more. So I would basically switch it that way. And with religion, you're also implying some type of a deity, whereas with philosophy, you may or may not have a deity involved. There's actually kind of a religion that's in between both of those, and that's actually Buddhism. It's considered a religion, but they don't really have a deity. It's kind of it was sort of in between. So religion, there's a deity that means God in our context. But with philosophy, it may not be. Your philosophy might be, I should be nice to people. That's a great philosophy. That's consistent with the Bible, but that's not a religion.
So the deity is usually the key there. So, but I guess all religions are philosophies, but not all philosophies are religions.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And I'll have that if I ever get asked that again.
Okay. Now, you are an expert on biblical prophecy, and my first question has to be, how many prophecies have come true in our lifetimes, say the last 50, 60 years?
Oh, it really depends on how you count them. Okay, let me give you a little bit of background. I wrote for my doctoral dissertation, for my PhD, I wrote a 565-page single space type dissertation on church history that had a little bit of prophecy in it. Then I decided, my wife and I had gone to the movies, and we saw a promotion for a movie called 2012 from Sony. And next time we went to the movies, they said that it won't come out until November of 2009. I said to my wife, people aren't that interested in history. Maybe I should take the prophecy part of my dissertation and add things to it and come up with a book about 2012. I mentioned that to answer your question, because in my book, by the way, just for your listeners, I said the world would not end in 2012. Okay, of course, anybody could have guessed that. And it really depends on what you mean about prophecies, predictions. World events aligned with like 32, 33 things I said would happen by December, the end of December of 2012. Most of those were directly or indirectly based upon biblical prophecies. But being partially fulfilled is not necessarily the same as total fulfillment. For example, there's a prophecy from the prophet Habakkuk, the Hebrew prophet, roughly 2,600 years ago. In the second chapter of Habakkuk, God says that this is an end time prophecy. It's going to tarry, but wait for it. And it's a prophecy about a highly indebted people, okay, who issues pledges. To me, they sound like treasury bills and treasury notes. Now, it hasn't been fulfilled yet. The prophecy said that this highly indebted nation is going to be taken over. So that part hasn't happened. But if you look throughout history, no nation, for example, has been more indebted than the United States. And I believe ultimately that prophecy will be fulfilled in the United States, but it isn't yet. However, in several of my books, I said that I believed the United States was going to increase its debt. And I've been right all along. Now, you could say, well, so does the Congressional Budget Office. Okay. But I didn't look at that. I looked at this prophecy and believed, and still believe, by the way, that it applies to the United States. And in one of my latest prophetic books, this one's called Unintended Consequences of Donald Trump Presidency, I said he would increase debt. Now, what's interesting to me about that, I wrote another book about Trump that came out a couple days before his first term. And I did an interview on the radio with a man who had been a candidate, or a delegate, excuse me, to the Republican convention that nominated Donald Trump. And I went through 6 or 7 things that I thought were going to happen in Trump's administration. And one of the ones I mentioned was that he would increase debt. Now, this individual agreed with me on everything except the debt side. He said, no, the debt's not going to go up under Donald Trump. I said, well, yes, it is. And it happened to be that. So getting back to prophecies, it depends how you define them. But we're seeing at least partial fulfillment of many things. I held this book up a few minutes ago, or a moment or so ago, and turns out like 14 things that I said would happen in the Trump administration have either happened or have started to happen. I'll give an example. Here's an obvious one. I said gold would hit record prices in US dollar terms. If any of your listeners have been following that, gold is up, I don't know, 25, 30% from when Donald Trump came in. I base that on the fact that I see biblical prophecies that talk about in the time of the end, mystery Babylon, people will get rich from trading with Babylon and they use gold. That's in the New Testament. You read that in the 18th chapter of the book of Revelation. But you can also back to Daniel chapter 11. And there's a leader called the beast, the king of the north. And you find that in the time of the end, he's going to accumulate gold. I don't see things like that about the US dollar. So based upon those prophecies from the Bible, you can say I extrapolated that I believed this meant that we would see gold hit record prices in US dollar terms. In one article, I speculated that would happen in 2025, but in my book, I didn't specify when. It's just that since the book's come out, it's already happened a zillion, quite a few times. And with prophecies, though, it really depends, again, how you define them to get more theological. Salvation is a prophecy, okay? You're prophesied, Jesus kind of came, eternal life, he who endures the end, and all these kind of things. So it really depends how you define prophecy.
Are biblical prophecies more accurate than those of other prophets, like Nostradamus or modern day prophets?
In my view, yes. However, it doesn't mean those other ones are never correct. When I wrote that 2012 book, one of the ways I was able to get on secular radio programs, as opposed to those who were on the religious side, was the fact that I looked at Mayan prophecies, Greco-Roman Catholic prophecies, Buddhist prophecies, Hindu prophecies. I believe there are certain prophecies out there which came from demonic sources, which are accurate to a degree, but inaccurate to others. So in my mind, when it comes down to it, there's a contradiction. I believe in biblical prophecy. On the other hand, I also believe that there's a devil. Okay, I think there is such a thing as Satan, the devil. And I also think he's got a plan. And some parts of his plan are actually laid out in non-biblical prophecies.
Religion seems to have cornered the market on prophecy, so to speak.
Well, a couple of reasons I would say. One is, as I mentioned before, the idea of salvation is prophetic. Most religions, or many religions, have some type of an afterlife doctrine. And that's basically a prophecy. Whether it's Hinduism, where they spin the wheel and you supposedly come back as some other creature, Christianity talks about the resurrection and gaining eternal life. So that's one factor. But I think part of the point of prophecy from a biblical perspective is so people will become more engaged. Jesus in the 24th chapter of Matthew, 13th chapter of Mark, and the 21st chapter of the book of Luke, those gospel accounts, he listed various things. And he said for his people to watch that. And in Luke 21, verse 36, I'm going to paraphrase it. Jesus said, watch and pray always that you be counted worthy to escape these things that will come to pass and to stand before the Son of Man. Now, I mention that because I believe that part of the purpose of prophecy from a biblical perspective and an Islamic perspective, because I've got a book on Islamic prophecies too, by the way, and from some other religions, is to motivate the faithful to do what they're supposed to do, to get people to say, okay, I'm not just supposed to be quiet, kind of how I am. To be counted worthy kind of absolutely suggests that we should examine ourselves and try to be better people based upon, if you believe the Bible, based on what the Bible says. If you believe the Quran, based on the Quran or whatever. Again, I don't want to sound like I'm an interfaith person because I'm not, but to answer your broader question, I think that's the answer.
Now, I would imagine that the big kahuna of prophecies, biblical prophecies, is the return of Christ. That's the grand prize of prophecy. And we've been waiting now for more than 2,000 years. But of the other lesser prophecies, do any of them have a time limit?
Well, some of them do because they were supposed to happen before Jesus comes.
Okay.
So in that respect. Now, there's also a tradition. Now, this tradition comes, according to Judaism, it comes from either the prophet Elijah or the school of Elijah. So we're going back thousands of years. And according to this tradition, Christians would call the millennium, is supposed to start 6,000 years after either the earth was created or when Adam and Eve sinned. in the Garden of Eden. Okay, I tend to say it's the second one, not the first one. And now it's a tradition. Now, early professors of Christ taught this tradition. You can look in the 2nd century, and you can see people considered saints by the Greco-Roman Catholics and the Protestants, like Irenaeus of Lyon, and also people like Hippolytus. There were some of these what are called early church fathers, in quotes. They taught this idea. Now, if this is the case, then we're pretty close to running out of that time. There was an archbishop from England by the name of Usher, an Anglican bishop, who felt that the 6,000 years would end in 1996. However, looking at other passages and other things, I've looked at this, and I believe it could be as late as 2035, maybe 2036. But again, that's not a hard, fast biblical prediction. You won't find in one place in the Bible, 6,000 years after Adam and Eve sinned, Jesus is going to return. What you do see, and this is from the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, and the New Testament, is a day is to God like 1,000 years, 1,000 years is like a day. That's in both places. So people have said, well, you read through Genesis, God, first day God did this, second, blah, 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 seventh day was the Sabbath. And so various ones, starting with the Jews, but then starting with professors of Christ later, said, well, maybe this means that, okay, each of these days is symbolic of 1,000 years, and that the Sabbath rest is when the world will become right again, or pleasant, et cetera, no more wars, et cetera. So that's kind of where that comes from. But again, it doesn't clearly say in the Bible that's absolutely what it means. But if that is the case, then I'm looking for various things to occur. I'm looking for, in what I hope is in my lifetime, I believe I have lived long enough, I expect to live long enough for this, to see, for example, a confederation involving Iran, Syria, and perhaps parts of Lebanon, and perhaps other places, causing destruction to the city of Jerusalem. That's based on a prophecy in Isaiah chapter 22, verses 6 through 8. Looking for other things to happen as well. The Bible talks about what is generally considered to be a peace deal, the book of Daniel, chapter 9, verses 26 and 27, that will be broken in the middle of it. Now, that deal has not yet happened, in my opinion, but if it does, that will also kind of give us a time frame, because once that deal has been confirmed by somebody called a prince, according to the Old Testament, 3.5 years later, it's broken. So kind of looking to see when that might happen. And when you look at what Jesus said in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, he said to look about this abomination that Daniel talked about. So Jesus is telling you, in terms of, if you want it from a time period, there's something that's going to happen that Daniel wrote about that you ought to pay attention to, because when you see that, a clock that we're wondering about will start.
How would we recognize when a prophecy comes true? Are you one of the people who would alert the rest of us that we just lived through a biblical prophecy, or any other kind of prophecy?
Well, yeah, I would say to that answer, yes. For example, I wrote something regarding, for example, what's been going on in Southern California with the protests and the rioting, et cetera. If you don't mind, and I'm bringing this up because I posted this at the cogwriter.com website. What I'm going to read comes from this particular book, which is available at Amazon. Okay, here's what I wrote in this book. Expect more protests against Donald Trump. As the 47th president, Donald Trump plans to deport all those not legally in the United States, though many do not think he can actually accomplish this. Trying that's expected to cause civil unrest and probably riots. There's issues with what Donald Trump says when he speaks. I expect protests. Donald Trump's been a polarizing figure, has offended many, including minorities, migrants, Muslims. Expect civil unrest and rioting. So I posted that today, and I posted a couple of days ago related to the rioting going on, and it's starting to happen. That's something that I put in the book. Now, by the way, the reason the book is or the book is called Unintended Consequences. I want to make it clear. I do not think Donald Trump is the Antichrist, like a radio host said to me that I did a radio interview recently. I don't believe he's the savior of humanity or the country. Okay. But I don't think he's intentionally doing things to cause problems this way. I mean, when I say unintended, that's why the book's called Unintended Consequences. Donald Trump, in my view, doesn't understand biblical prophecy. And while there's a certain logic to certain things he does, and certain chaos and other things he does, if I could word it that way, I don't think he believes or has read biblical prophecies to understand what he's doing and how these may actually tie in with them. But again, to answer your question, yes, I've been writing about things. I post things when they happen. Interpretation or understanding biblical prophecies.
Could it be that we're sitting around waiting for prophecies to come true that already did maybe 1,000 years ago?
That's the view of people called preterists. There are some prophecies that did take place then. I'm how can I put this? I guess I'm ignorant of prophecies I'm ignorant of that may have been fulfilled that way. But I'll throw something out though, a couple different kind of prophecies that people don't think about. 45 years ago, I had a roommate when I was in the military, and he borrowed either my Bible. Yeah, I think he borrowed one of my Bibles, and he read the New Testament. And it was interesting. We had a conversation about a brief conversation about things people don't think of as prophecies. I said, things that Jesus said are happening. He says, it's like what? I said, well, you read the New Testament. Didn't you read Jesus said, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away? He said, yes. So what? So what? He said that nearly 2,000 years ago. I've never gone out and said, heaven and earth will pass away, but Bob Thiel's words aren't going to pass away. Okay. And we actually have more documents, ancient documents of gospel accounts and quotes from Jesus than pretty much any other ancient document for like 1,800 to 2,000 years ago. I mean, it's by far the most. And so that was a prophecy. But people say, well, that's a prophecy. Yeah, that's what he said. He also said people would come in his name and say they were him and deceive many. And that's happened. One of the more bizarre ones, though, that most people don't recognize is one that's in the book of Revelation. Now, you might say my interpretation is a stretch, but bear with me. In the book of Revelation, chapter 2, there's a prophecy to the church at Ephesus. And basically, the Apostle John is told by Jesus to write, you've lost your first love, and if you don't repent, I'm going to remove your candlestick from its place. Okay? Now, I believe this has multiple interpretations, but I'd like to give one that's kind of unique. I've been to Ephesus twice with my wife. Ephesus used to be on the coast of Turkey. So Turkey kind of looks like this, and Ephesus is used to be about here. It was on the coast. Asia Minor, which is now Turkey, was the wealthiest or the second wealthiest province in the ancient Roman Empire. They were wealthy comparatively to the rest of the world back at that time. Well, as far as moving their candlestick, Ephesus is no longer on the ocean. It's, I think, 6 miles, 10 kilometers inland. A river silted, okay? Silted River filled it all up. I was, last time I was in Ephesus, I tried to look toward the ocean, and I couldn't see it. I was up on a hill, and I couldn't see it. And I don't have the picture to show you. I had my wife take a picture. So this is a picture from Ephesus, and you can't see it. You're really, really far away. So that's one I think that was fulfilled in a way nobody would have expected, that people haven't really paid attention to. And again, that would be an interpretation, but I do think it's interesting. Again, it moved that way from that far from the coast.
Does prophecy depend on faith, or does faith depend on prophecy?
If you put credence in a prophecy, then you have some kind of faith in it. But I don't think it takes. I mean, people can write predictions all the time. You don't have to have faith; they come to pass, and you might believe them. But if you believe them before they come to pass, I would say that takes faith. I think prophecy can be motivating for faith, particularly as they start to get fulfilled. But I'm not convinced that one is dependent upon the other.
Your book about Donald Trump is called Unintended Consequences. It seems to me that prophecy and unintended consequences are somewhat of a contradiction. Wouldn't
Correct.
unintended consequences be more the result of prayer than prophecy?
Yes, but again, the actual title of the book is Unintended Consequences and Donald Trump's Presidency. I'm focusing on unintended consequences of his presidency, which they're unintended by him, but they tie in with a prophecy. That's what I was trying to say with that title.
Can the manifestation of a prophecy depend upon advancements in technology that could not have been imagined 2,000 years ago? Like,
Absolutely.
did the creation of the internet unleash the power of a prophecy?
Yes. And I'll mention two or three very briefly. One, in Revelation chapter 13, verses 15 through 18, it talks about an image of the beast doing certain things that couldn't be done before, but also talks about controlling all buying and selling. Until we had computers and digital money, that's not possible. Because in the old days, you and I could meet in the woods. I could give you a copper coin and you could give me a chicken. They wouldn't be able to control our buying and selling. But now, as more and more becomes digitized, absolutely. And also, there's a prophecy in the book of Amos about a famine of the word of God. People will look everywhere for it. I believe this is talking about, in modern times, internet censorship. See, I don't believe there'll be no Bibles. Okay, there's millions of Bibles, so I don't believe the time will come will not be a Bible on the earth. But I do believe that it's going to be difficult to find certain information that was on the internet, and I think that's consistent with the prophecy from Amos. So those are two that come off the top of my head that would not have been possible. For example, when the Apostle John penned the book of Revelation called the Apocalypse, you couldn't control buying and selling. Furthermore, in that book, now this one's not related to technology. He talked about a 200 million man army. That wasn't possible in his day. There weren't 200 million men. Now there are. Even Mao Zedong made a crack about that once that China can raise a 200 million man army. So some of these things were not possible when the prophets wrote them down, but they are now.
So, and now we have artificial intelligence on the horizon as well. That certainly could stir the pot a little bit, I would imagine.
Oh yes, I think that'll help to do with control of buying and selling, and trying to get people to worship the image of the beast that we're warned about in Revelation.
Now, you have a radio program. Were there ever any prophecies about the power and influence of radio?
I don't know about radio specifically, but what we do know is there's a prophecy in Matthew 24, verse 14. The gospel of the kingdom will be preached to the world as a witness, and then the end will come. I think mass media, including radio and the internet, are some of the tools that will be used for that prophecy to be fulfilled. And that's actually one of the reasons that we have the radio presence that we have, and we're looking at increasing our radio presence. Of course, we're on multiple internet platforms as well.
Well, Doctor, it's been a very fascinating conversation. Is there anything I didn't ask you about that you'd just like to share?
Biblical prophecies are coming to pass. That's kind of the main part, the point I want to get across. The other part that I would get across for people who are Christian or want to be Christian or consider themselves Christian, I'd like to quote Jude 3, which says, "Contend earnestly for the faith once for all delivered to the saints." And that's what I would advise your audience. That includes paying attention to biblical prophecies.
And if someone wanted to listen to your radio show but did not live in an area near one of your broadcast stations, is there a way they can find you?
Oh, yes. You can find our Bible News Prophecy YouTube channel because that's one of the ones that we use on the radio. It happens all the time. And we also have Bible News Prophecy online radio. And again, you can find that at the cogwriter.com website, cogwriter.com website.
Dr. Teal has written many books, hosts a radio show, and you can also follow Dr. Teal at BibleNewsProphecy.net. It was a pleasure speaking with Dr. Teal, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. The Listening Tube is written and produced by yours truly. Copyright 2025. Thank you for putting your ear to the Listening Tube. My guest next week will be Beth Green. I'm your host, Bob Woodley, for Thou ad infinitum.